Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're ready to begin the afternoon portion of our program. This is going to be a conversation between Rob Havers and Ed Lengel, and I'm going to turn it over to Rob to introduce Ed. But Rob, for those of you who don't know, is the former director of the National Churchill Museum in Fulton and is now president of the George C. Marshall Foundation. Rob.
David, thank you very much. A very good afternoon to you all. It is a delight to be here in a wonderful venue celebrating a wonderful individual, also at a very important moment in history. Tomorrow we will mark the 100th anniversary of the armistice, of the end of the First World War. It is very appropriate then that I should be sitting here with Professor Ed Lengel, one of the foremost historians of the Great War, of the First World War in this country. Well-known battlefield tour expert, will be leading a tour to Normandy next year for the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the Great War, its impact on the United States and Britain and indeed the world, and look at some of the contemporary echoes of that terrible, terrible conflict. Ed is the author of several works on the First World War, To Conquer Hell, The Meuse Argonne, 1918, and most recently, Never in Finer Company, the story of the Great War's Lost Battalion. Ed, if you can, begin, please, with a little bit of a synopsis about this book, what led you to write it.
The book is a presentation of the stories of four men, because I believe getting to the lives and experiences of individuals is the best way to understand the Great War, to get from the big picture, the large statistics, to get to the lives of individuals and how they experienced them. There are 3 Medal of Honor recipients. 2 of them, Charles Whittlesey and George McMurtry, were commanders of the Lost Battalion. George McMurtry being a millionaire stockbroker, Charles Whittlesey, a very successful New York City lawyer who took command of a very diverse group of men. The third is Alvin C. York, Sergeant York of the Gary Cooper movie fame, who is also my third cousin. I'm a family member, so it's very important to me. And then the fourth is the great journalist, the great flamboyant American sports writer and reporter Damon Runyon. These 4 men went into a common experience in the Argonne Forest in October of 1918. Whittlesey and McMurtry being surrounded, attacked for several days on all sides by the German troops. Alvin York was involved in the action that rescued the Lost Battalion, and then Damon Runyon interviewed them just as they walked out and brought their story and the stories of these individuals back to the United States and helped to define our understanding of that war there. And then I covered their experiences in trying to deal with the powerful emotions that they had, the powerful memories that they had of the war, and the different paths that they took. I think it's important, whether we're looking at British or Commonwealth experiences, European experiences of the war, or American experiences of the war, not to generalize, but to recognize that each followed a different path. Some certainly followed a tragic path, but others were able to take very difficult experiences and turn them into positive things.
The Great War is a war of scale. From the British perspective, the British and Empire's perspective, 1 million British and Empire dead, a phenomenal figure. Do you think, Ed, that a discussion of individuals in the way that you have approached this book is perhaps a way to humanize that experience? Is that a way to understand a war of such magnitude?
Well, Churchill's adversary, the very evil man Joseph Stalin, once said a very wise thing, which was that one death is a tragedy, 40,000 deaths are a statistic. And that, I think, gets to the core of our inability to understand this war. Certainly in the United States, we tend to generalize about the massive scale of the suffering. And in this country, and the American culture particularly, it's like a switch turns off in our minds. We don't want to hear anymore. If we can, instead of that, get to the individuals, recognize, so I've often said the great British art historian Sir Kenneth Clarke said in his speech at the end of his great television series, Civilization, men haven't changed much in the past 2,000 years. We share a common humanity. And if we can look at the experiences of these individuals, recognize our common human qualities, and identify with the individual people, we can gain a personal understanding of this conflict.
As we mark the centenary tomorrow, it's a significant event in the United Kingdom, around the Commonwealth, in Europe. It is too in the United States, and the First World War Centennial Commission in this country has done a good job, I think, of bringing the Great War to millions of Americans today. What does the Great War really, though, mean to most Americans, do you think, to the extent that you can make a pronouncement like that?
The Centennial Commission has done a wonderful job. They've been fighting an uphill battle because there was very little recognition of in this country of the significance of World War I. Again, I think because of this mentality that it has nothing to teach us except tragedy, and I think Americans don't deal with that well. We like war narratives that are more sweeping, that have good guys and bad guys, that have clear conclusions. So it's been a difficult process, but we've come to recognize the scale of the significance in this country. I often point out the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which began on September 26, 1918, ended on November 11th, was and remains the largest and the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States of America. Remains true up to this day. In about 3 weeks, think of this on the American scale, not on the British scale, because certainly the Somme was much larger and much bloodier. But on the American scale, in about 3 weeks, 26,000 American soldiers killed, with over 100,000 casualties. And I often point out to people that's more than half, well more than half the total combat killed in the Korean War, approaching half the total combat killed in the Vietnam War. So there's beginning to be some understanding of the scale. There's beginning to be, as I talk about the war, I get hundreds of emails from descendants of veterans. Americans are becoming aware of how their experiences changed their families. The changes that they brought home changed them personally. But I'm afraid, I certainly hope this is not the case, but I have a fear that after tomorrow, we're going to switch it off again in the United States. And I hope that won't be true, but I think the biggest challenge is going to be maintaining awareness after tomorrow.
It's going to be very interesting, I think, not only in the United States, but in the UK and beyond. How do you keep commemorating an event after its 100th anniversary? We will see. In the 1920s and 1930s, on the back of a rash, really, of memoirs, personal experiences of the war, there began to be entrenched in the popular mind, and that happened over a period of time, the sense of the lost generation, a demographic catastrophe, but also of wasted lives, frustration and futility. How did that come about, Ed?
I started my career as a British historian and spent many years reading hundreds upon hundreds of British and Commonwealth war memoirs, diaries, letters. And it's clear that in the late 1920s, an idea developed of disillusionment, of the lost generation. It's a sweeping narrative that says millions of young men and women also went off to war with naive ideas of what war would be. They were all crushed and broken by their experiences of that war, all of them. They all came home traumatized, and they all came home questioning and rejecting ideas of God, country, all the traditional ideals of the Victorian era or the Edwardian era with which they'd grown up. If you look at it more closely, you see that yes, it originates from some great veterans' memoirs, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Edmund Blunden, which I think is one of the finest British war memoirs, Undertones of War. But it also originated from civilians. Vera Brittain's great memoir, Testament of Youth. And it originated from many who had never experienced the war, who were trying to develop a narrative of what the war was about. But it's interesting, in about 1930, there was a backlash in the UK against this narrative. And the backlash came from veterans, from many English and British veterans who had experienced the war, including a wonderful book by Charles Carrington called A Subaltern's Diary. Douglas Jerrold wrote a book called The Lie About the War, and they were furious that this type of narrative was being imposed upon them. And I think Churchill sympathized with their anger, saying that they all rejected their beliefs, that they all rejected belief in their country and their nation and their God, and that just was not true. I think if you look at the soldiers' experiences in the UK and the United States as well, you see a great diversity of opinion. You see in the middle a middle ground of ambivalence, of many who, yes, thought the war was a terrible thing, but still felt like it was something that they had to fight. But you probably see just as many on one side who said that the war was a cleansing and purifying experience for them, and a positive experience, as you do those who said it was an awful, heartbreaking experience. It's important to recognize that, because we cannot understand the Second World War unless we understand that many saw the First World War as a positive experience and even an unfinished business that had to be finished.
I think that's a very important point there, Ed. And if you look out at the men and the women who fight and win the Second World War, and Winston Churchill, of course, George C. Marshall being another, they have direct experience of that first conflict. One conflict, perhaps, interrupted by a brief pause of 20 or so years. How did that experience of that first war, Ed, influence the conduct of the second?
On a number of different levels. Certainly for Winston Churchill, it influenced his own concept of strategy in the First World War. He certainly had not gotten beyond, in many respects, his idea that he had tried to implement it at Gallipoli. And incidentally, Gallipoli, although it was a fiasco, was a very near-run thing. It came very close to success, had it not been for a number of blunders. It also, for others, and particularly the French, created a fear of a repetition of these type of mass casualties that they had experienced in the war. Clearly affected the French conduct in 1940, and their fear of what had happened then happening again, and contributed heavily to their collapse. Certainly for the Germans, their common belief that they'd gotten away with, which was wrong, that the German army had not been defeated in the field, which it was, their belief that they had been betrayed by the socialists at home, influenced the rise of Nazi ideology in the 1930s, and certainly the idea of how to conduct the Second World War. Adolf Hitler, for example, his idea of the Blitzkrieg, a lot of people don't realize, was really based on his fear of a long war like World War I that would have a big impact on German civilians. He thought a Blitzkrieg will allow us to end wars and campaigns quickly without having an adverse impact on the German people. So that was his concept. The Americans, though, we were averse to learning lessons from the First World War. The United States Army made very little effort to study what had happened in that war, between the wars. There's still no official American history of that war. And it was almost as if we preferred to imagine that it hadn't happened. we kind of blanked it out of our minds, and we ended up having to relearn many of the same lessons in 1942, 1944 that we should have learned in 1918.
I think we heard at some point this morning the idea that the First World War was a close-run thing for Imperial Germany. Most certainly was not. The Germans are defeated conclusively on the battlefield. Right. And that stab-in-the-back myth that they weren't defeated is what, of course, helps Hitler propel himself to power. Interestingly, we heard a little bit from Alan Packwood about Churchill in the 45 general election, defeated conclusively by Clement Attlee and the Labour Party. And sometimes, speaking to US audience, it seems impossible that a man like Churchill could lose to somebody like Clement Attlee. Churchill famously, with a throwaway comment, said that Attlee's a modest man, and indeed he has a lot to be modest about. Yet Clement Attlee, a major in World War I, wounded and served with great distinction on the battlefields of Gallipoli, and indeed the second to last man off the beaches at Gallipoli, retained a lifelong respect for Churchill's strategic vision as demonstrated by Gallipoli. It didn't work out, but he certainly thought that willingness to think outside the box was key, and why he was so supportive of him during the war years, less so, of course, with the peace. We heard also from Dan Todman, who several years ago wrote a great book called The First World War, Myth and Memory. And he looked at the evolution of how the war was remembered in the 1930s, in the 1960s, when the young men of that 1914, 1918 generation were early older age, then the 1990s. We are now on the cusp of the 2020s, another generation. If we assume that a generation is 20 or 30 years, unless you're a Scottish nationalist, it's a lot less than that time frame. How will we view the war in the 2020s, Ed, looking back?
That's a brilliant question. I fear we're going to revert to the kind of simplistic notions that we've had about the war in the past as being simply nothing more than a tragedy on a grand scale from which we have really nothing to learn except mournfulness. There is going to be an increased focus after the centennial concludes on the efforts of servicemen and women to return home, and on the challenges that they faced in adjusting mentally to returning to their families, returning to their communities when they have these powerful memories of wartime, which are not all traumatic. Many of them are, but others, the comradeship, for example, were much more positive. But they had to return to a society that really made little to no effort to care for their needs. That was true in the United States, and it was true in Europe. They had to learn to band together and care for each other on their own. That's going to be a focus in the 2020s, but it's going to continue, I think, to be, I hate to be so pessimistic, but it's going to revert to some degree simply in this notion that this was nothing more than a mass tragedy caused by national jealousies, when in fact it's a very human story, and it's not necessarily very different from other experiences of humanity at other times in our history.
We often hear, with regard to the British experience, that it's the death of innocence, and that the cozy, structured world of Britain prior to World War I was swept away in that carnage. What is the impact on US society, by contrast?
Americans tried, and incidentally, as a comparison with Clement Attlee, at the very end of the war, literally days before the war ended, the armistice came into effect, there was an election in the United States. Woodrow Wilson made an appeal to the American electorate to return a Democratic Congress, because he said, this will allow me to speak for Americans with a unified voice at the peace table. Well, what actually happened was a resounding victory for the Republicans. And Wilson had to go representing a divided United States, and of course his campaign for the League of Nations ended in disaster for him personally as well as for the United States in not joining the League of Nations. We attempted, and Great Britain went through some similar things in the 1920s, a return to business as usual. It was certainly true, and Stanley Baldwin reflected that. It was certainly true as well in the United States, but even more so, in that Americans came to view very quickly the war as a big mistake. We never should have gotten involved in the first place. Europeans are trying to pull us into their problems. We need to focus on simply getting them to repay their debts and not worry about the wider problems of reparations, of economic dislocation, social dislocation, and kind of just wish it all away. The lessons were not imbibed deeply in this country. Now, there were some exceptions, and I have to give a shout out for Herbert Hoover. We've talked about FDR. Herbert Hoover certainly did not do well in his one term as a president, but he was one of the few Americans right after the end of the war who took a leading role in trying to feed the people of Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia going through a civil war. He was an example for Americans remaining involved in the world. He probably, in a century dominated by dictators who killed millions of people, Herbert Hoover is estimated to have saved the lives of 20 million people in the early 1920s and the 19-teens through his work with the American Relief Association. So it's a contrast, but for the most part, we tried to simply walk away from the world.
In the Daily Telegraph, which is a popular British newspaper, there's been a series in the last few weeks that endeavors to connect the past with the present and looks back at the sort of social attitudes, the modes of waging war, the reasons for fighting in 1914 and between 1914 and 1918 and the contemporary world. And it's posed some of the questions such as, could we fight another great war? Is there a groundswell of national resilience, of the kind of courage that we saw in the First World War? Does that exist today? It's an inaccurate, it's an awkward way to try and think about the modern world. What do you think we can take away, Ed, from those that fought in that conflict and the contemporary world today?
Obviously, it would be exceptionally difficult to fight another war like that with the benefit of hindsight in the 21st century if we knew that a war was going to last for several years, that there were going to be millions of casualties, mass casualties, and that we had an expectation that it would be like World War I. I think we would not want to get into it. But the truth is, of course, and by we I mean human beings generally, but in 1914, of course, nobody expected the war to turn into the type of war that it became. Europeans, Americans didn't know that this was going to happen. Is it possible that the same human failings, and they are human failings, that led the world into war in 1914 could lead the world into another war in the 21st century that would last for years? Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is a lesson that really transcends history, the history of the 20th century. Many other conflicts, Great Britain and the Napoleonic Wars, nobody imagined that Britain would be able to sustain war for such a long time and such an economically draining conflict, and yet they did. They found the resources. They found the human resources. I think sometimes we underestimate, even in the United States, some people might call it resiliency, some might call it ignorance and bullheadedness. The willingness of people to make massive sacrifices for abstract concepts is something that hasn't left us. It's there. and it could happen again.
You, Ed, as an American historian and a historian of the First World War in particular, it's not a conflict that is, for obvious reasons, as popular in this country. What attracted you to this conflict?
What attracted me, actually, was starting with reading the memoirs. I started with reading, again, Sassoon, Graves, Blunden. Then I read what I think is the finest First World War memoir ever written, which most people don't know about, called There's a Devil in the Drum by John Lucy, the Irish memoirist, written in the early 1930s. Then I read some great American memoirs, Australian memoirs, Canadian, German, French, others. Those brought out for me the humanity of the conflict. And I am fascinated by what people do when they experience the unfathomable, the unprecedented, the overwhelming. These soldiers and nurses, ambulance drivers, and others who went into the war experienced a profound shock. And if you look at how they experienced it while it happened, and then you look at how they dealt with it afterwards, how they processed it, you can find powerful insight into the human character, insights into ourselves, such as how we can be broken, we can succumb, we can be made worse by our experiences. Adolf Hitler being an obvious example, there are many others. But also sometimes how we can take the most powerful and often most negative experiences, such as one of my characters, Alvin C. York, did, and turn them into positives, I think provides great hope and great uplift. Alvin York was consumed by guilt. He killed probably 30 Germans almost face to face in one day. He saw his best friend killed before his eyes. Everybody called him a hero. He came home and was treated as a celebrity, and he was torn to pieces inside and struggled to find peace. But the way he found peace was he took every single penny that was given to him, and he got hundreds of thousands for books and movies. Every single penny goes to charity for the Alvin York Foundation to lift up the poor people of East Tennessee. That's how he came home. That's how he found peace. And we can find many other stories like that of people, men and women, who took tragedies and turned them into opportunities to make the world a better place. That intrigues me.
The generic understanding of the US role in the war is that the US comes in towards the end, decisively turns the course of the conflict. Millions of fresh, eager troops who fight tremendously well on very many occasions. And this is the tipping point of the war. The Germans certainly are terrified of the prospect of what the US can bring to this conflict when the US gets fully engaged. And they chance their arms somewhat in spring of 1918 to try to win the war before the Americans are really on the ground. Is there a more nuanced understanding of the role of the US in this conflict?
This remains quite a powerful debate, actually a pretty divisive debate between American and British historians in particular. I think the French are inclined to look much more positively on the American military contribution, as are the Germans. The British, I think, following the great British military historian John Terraine, have tended to somewhat minimize the American military contribution. Then on the other hand, you have Americans, with all love and respect for the United States Marine Corps, when I hear sometimes Marine officers and leaders talking about how they saved Paris in 1918 because the French were all running away and the Marines ended the war and defeated the Germans, that's simply not true. The nuance is that, first of all, American financial support leading up to 1917 was extremely important. The American moral impact in kind of bucking up French and British morale in 1918 was exceptionally important. You look at contemporary records, they show that. They provided a certain willingness to go on, but also the impact on the Germans. You can read the German records, and the Germans were shocked at the health, at the aggressiveness of the American troops, including green American troops. And there was a palpable effect on German morale. Just one anecdote, when the Germans captured their first batch of American prisoners in late 1917, they decided to make a propaganda, what they thought would be a propaganda coup out of it, which terribly backfired. I wish I had a copy of the photo here. There were about 9 Americans and prisoners. They decided to photograph them with a whole bunch of German soldiers surrounding them. And they thought the Americans would look demoralized, look how easily they're captured. Well, the Americans are about this tall, and the Germans are about this tall. And the Americans are wearing these big, heavy great coats. They're clearly very comfortable, and they have big scowls on their faces. And the German soldiers are kind of looking up like that, and that kind of encapsulated right there, even for the German people, there's no way that we can win this war. It had a very palpable impact. The military impact on the Western Front, yes, it did grind down a lot of German divisions. We did take some important territory, but we didn't win the war. The British were winning the major battles on the battlefield in late 1918 with 100 Days.
I think in a small plug for General George C. Marshall, who of course serves as a logistics officer in the Meuse-Argonne, he's at Pershing's headquarters at the end of the war and sees firsthand, and at the Paris Peace Conference, how not to end a war, and understands that in all probability Marshal Foch's claim that this is merely an armistice for 20-odd years is going to come true. George C. Marshall, after World War II, as Secretary of State, is determined to put right what should have been put right at the end of 1919, and does a very good job. And the peace that he helped broker then, economic peace, has been with us, God willing, thus far, and will continue to be with us. We'll open up the floor for some questions in a minute, but Winston Churchill, of course, the subject of this conference, as always. If you haven't been to Ypres in Belgium, I would commend it completely, and to go to the Menin Gate, which is a war memorial for British and Empire dead in that part of the front. And on that gate are the names of 50,000 British dead who have no known grave, which is astonishing. Winston Churchill went to the Menin Gate just after it was opened in the early 1920s and said, "There is no more sacred spot on this planet for the British than here in Ypres." And that speaks to the impact that's at the back of Churchill's mind when this other conflict, World War II, comes around. Ed Lengel, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll just say the Menin Gate is, to me, the most powerful and beautiful living war memorial in the world. It's hard to watch it without choking up. Everybody should go see it.
Ed Lengel, thank you very much. We will... We have a couple of roving microphones. If anyone has questions for Professor Lengel, he would be delighted to entertain them.
Hello, I have been to Ypres and have been deeply inspired by that. One of my favorite stories about the First World War is the Christmas Truce. Yeah. And I often wondered about how it was for those soldiers after the truce, where they connected so beautifully and then went back to battle. And I wonder if you have any information about them.
It's a beautiful story, I agree, for any who are not familiar with the Christmas Truce of 1914, Christmas of 1914, that British and German soldiers fraternized spontaneously in no man's land and recognized some of each other's humanity and their interactions with each other, sometimes sang Christmas carols together. It was a very poignant moment, particularly we look at it with the distance and hindsight. Of course, after this happened, British and German military leaders were horrified and insisted that nothing of the sort would happen again, and it didn't happen again. Men and officers were told, if you permit this to happen, you'll be susceptible to court-martial and execution. Now, that being said, even in the trenches of Verdun and the Somme, you can still see those flickering flames of humanity going on. One common thread among soldiers' accounts of that war is that there's little to no hatred of the enemy in their mindset. In the trenches was the least nationalistic part of the world, really. They were fighting, as we see now, they were motivated in fighting for each other, fighting for their friends, their comrades. Another thing is that historians have recognized something called the live and let live system that developed in the trenches, a kind of an unspoken truce in many sectors of the front where troops on both sides would hold back from raids, they would hold back from needless artillery bombardments, needless machine gun barrages, and that unspoken truce, if anybody broke it, the other side would break it as well and retaliate in kind. So the soldiers continued to maintain a powerful, deep undercurrent and desire to return to humanity, and you see that at the end of the war as well.
Full disclosure, Ed's a friend of mine, and he did not plant this question. In looking at the Doughboys' experience as fighting men in the First World War as compared to the British, the French, and the Germans, did you find or do you believe there to be a particular difference in the way they fought the war, either as officers or as enlisted men?
Yeah. Wow, that's a wonderful question. And incidentally, I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States about World War I. And they're very interested in the lessons from World War I. And General Dunford, one of the questions that he was asking was just that. Is there an inherent difference with the American fighting man as opposed to others? Pershing certainly believed so. Pershing believed that Americans were naturally tended to value individual initiative, to question authority somewhat more, that they had more inherent aggressiveness, a desire to get out of the trenches and fight. And in fact, he viewed too close contact with the Europeans, including the British, as corrupting. And he actually used that word because we need to remain true to our American qualities. On the other hand, there's some interesting connections. The argument has been made if in 1918, if you go to the Western Front, you want to find an aristocratic officer corps with aristocratic notions of combat and service and self-sacrifice, you have to go to the Americans. So the Americans in 1918, their field officers were the blue bloods. They were regarded as the best and brightest of our country, and the mentality they had was almost identical with the British in 1914. So many of these young British officers, the sons of aristocracy, of the upper classes, the public school boys, going off to fight and sacrificing themselves out of a sense of duty, absolutely connected with the Americans in 1918. So there are similarities, there are profound differences as well. I do think the Americans had a very quick learning curve and an almost fanatical aggressiveness that was quite different and unusual at the time.
As an addition, an old colleague of mine from Sandhurst, who was a lieutenant colonel in the New Zealand Army, but taught at the Australian Military Academy, did a serious study of British Empire troops in World War I with the intent of determining beyond shadow of a doubt who were the most efficient, who were the best fighters. The Australians, of course, believed it was them. The rough, tough South Africans also, the New Zealanders thought it was probably them, but they weren't going to boast about it. But my colleague's conclusion was actually it was the mild-mannered Canadians who were the most effective of all the British Empire troops. Most resilient, most aggressive, most feared by the Germans, which was a very interesting conclusion. Question here, sir.
We got a mic back there with a
We have a
questioner,
mic?
and then we can bring it up here.
So why didn't both sides use gas more extensively towards the end of the war?
The question was, why didn't both sides use gas more extensively towards the end of the war? The Germans, I think, did use gas very extensively, and particularly against the Americans. The Americans did not handle gas discipline well in a defensive capacity, and the Americans suffered proportionately much higher gas casualties than the soldiers of any other nation in World War I, proportionately speaking. They didn't like to wear them, they didn't like the loss of vision, the loss of identity. The Germans used it very heavily. The Americans were not prepared to deploy gas in an offensive capacity as well, partly because we hadn't studied how to use it very well. There was a dawning recognition of the brutality and the barbarity of poison gas, and also the judgment of future generations. And that may have had some impact on the French and the British in kind of tapering off a bit the use of poison gas later in the war. But the Germans continued to use it with great intensity. They called them saturation bombardments. Absolutely pulverize areas with gas, mustard gas in particular.
Probably time for one more question, gentlemen here.
Some years ago, I mentioned World War I in an introductory class, and one of my students came up afterward and thanked me for mentioning World War I. She had heard of World War II, and she said she should have supposed there had been a World War I, but she really didn't know anything about it. For a student like that, what short book would you recommend as a complete introduction to the subject, but not too long?
I would have that student read a memoir first. And I do not mean All Quiet on the Western Front, which is assigned ad nauseum everywhere. Although it's a beautiful piece of literature, Erich Maria Remarque actually experienced very little of the trenches. So it comes more from a perception. I would have them read, as an American student, there's a great American war memoir called Toward the Flame by Hervey Allen, of a soldier of the 28th Division who experiences incredible things. For British audiences, again, I would recommend Siegfried Sassoon, but also balance that with John Lucy's memoir I mentioned, or Charles Carrington's A Subaltern's War, who believed Carrington experienced everything that Sassoon did and more. But Carrington came away believing, I fought for God and country, king and country, and I did the right thing. And you know what? I'd do it again. As terrible as it was, I would do it again. So it's important to balance those perspectives and make them personal.
Thank you, Rob Havers. Thank you, Ed Lengel.
Thank you.
Good job, Ed.
I'm sure it won't come as a shock to anyone that follows ice hockey to learn about the tenacity of Canadians. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a 15-minute break and resume at 2:30.